What's up, everyone? We're back with some more of the First Descendant. Now, we're going to be getting into some coring, and I think it's really important to simplify this process as much as possible, especially for those of you guys that are still struggling. And I wanted to make sure that with this process, you're not only able to get into it, but you're also able to actually understand why you are doing something. And I think that that's going to be the biggest takeaway, because then that's going to allow you from here on out to have a little bit more of a better understanding when you have to make decisions on your own and even making your own builds potentially. So let's go ahead and let's dive right into it. Now, before we jump into the main stuff, which is the cores, I want to make sure that I show you guys the Void Erosion Purge map. And the big takeaway here is going to be the attribute resistances, because this is actually going to be a very important part to you building your guns. Now, if we take a look here and we look at the attribute resistance for the enemy type and the attribute resistance for the specific element, you'll notice that for the Order of Truth, it is going to be the enemy type. And then the attribute resistance is going to be very weak resistance to electricity, normal resistance to fire, normal resistance to ice, and a strong resistance to toxic. Now, why is this important, you may ask? Well, this is very important because the enemies all the way up the tower, even if you were at earlier stages, if it's Order of Truth, they're always going to have a very weak resistance to electricity. This is very important. If we find another type, Legion of Darkness, for example, they're always going to be very weak to ice. So this means that with the tower, you can go into the tower investing in a specific attribute, and it is always going to work against that specific type of resistance. And so, for example, if you build a gun with Legion of Darkness, which we'll talk about that a little bit more, and it's also an ice-based gun, that's also going to be beneficial all the way up, right? Now, granted, in the beginning, you can kind of ooga booga certain things. I know the Inez strat exists and a couple of other Descendants exist where you're just able to use skill damage. So you're not really thinking about your gun. But I think it's really important to note this because it's been there the entire time. It's just that now when we're looking at stages 21 and up, you actually have to start to apply the actual madness that they have already in the tower. So, you know, just kind of thinking, just rationalizing all of this stuff, it's there. Now that we've gotten that important tidbit out of the way, let's actually dive into the parts of the process that are extremely important, which is equipping your cores and crafting your cores. Let's actually start off with the equipping the cores. Now, if we take a look here at the last dagger, what's really important to note is that you're going to need the core binding material. And with that material, it is made by using the Void Abyss metal fragments. You can get that from the 400% dungeons in the game, and you can also obtain that from doing the Void Abyss. Currently, at the recording of this video, the Void Abyss is housed by Defiler, but if you're watching this much later, it could be a different Void boss, okay? But keep in mind, if you're earlier in the game, you'll be doing 400%. If you're much later in the game, you're probably going to be doing things like Defiler and a mix of 400% dungeons, depending on the rotation for that day. Now, when we're looking at the last dagger, one thing that's noted on every single gun is that every gun has a free augment slot, which means you can equip any core in that slot. Very simple. But they're also going to have their own 4 unique slots, and with that it varies to each gun. So for example, the last dagger has firepower augmentation for 2 slots, and then it has tactical augmentation for another 2 slots. Now we go and we take a look here at, say for example, the clairvoyance. The clairvoyance is going to have that same free augment slot. Then you'll see it has an attribute augment slot. It also has a tac augment slot, and then of course you have the precision augment slot. Now, really quick, just to kind of give you some of those stat values that you'll be able to see if we take a look here on the grantable options, right? You have your weak point, or these are under the hit augments, which is weak point damage, firearm critical hit rate, firearm critical hit damage. Under precision, you have recoil, you have hip fire accuracy, weapon change speed, sprint speed, grappling hook charge time. You have aim shot accuracy. Under the special augmentation, which is for the specific enemy type, which for example, that's for bonus firearm attack, you have Legion of Darkness, you have Order of Truth, and you have Legion of Immortality. And then if we go back to our clairvoyance, just to show one of, actually, let's look at another weapon that has attribute. Actually, let's use my Albion Cavalry. You'll see here that the grantable options are going to be fire attack, chill attack, electric attack, and toxic. Okay, so Very, very important to note. Same thing with the tax, right? You have the attribute status effect, trigger rate, rounds per magazine, fire rate, reload time modifier, and that's that, okay? So these are very important to note, okay? Because these are going to be the stat values that you're essentially rolling for. Now, we're gonna revisit this in 1 second because I wanna talk about the crafting, because the crafting is also another important component. When you're farming, this is now one of the resources that you're going to be seeing drop, which is the core amplifier, and the core amplifier is going to be allowing you to fuse your cores up. Now, the other thing that you want to keep in mind is that my advice is to work up and not try to jump straight into just going core 10s. The reason why that is because core 10s, granted, are definitely extremely powerful, even if you can get a low roll on them, but you have to roll against stat values. If it wasn't for the fact that you have to roll against other values, then I would say, yeah, just shoot for core 10s. But the problem is that you have to roll against other stat values. Now, the thing is that you have a higher probability of having more success when you're rolling in a, say, for example, a value that doesn't have that many rolls. For example, the hit augments only have 3 values that you can roll for, right? So that's not going to be insane. Whereas precision has 6. So rolling the die on that is going to be a little bit rougher than rolling the die on hit augmentation. Just for food for thought there, right? Now, with that being the case, ultimately, my advice would be to work on getting to your core 9s, because as you get to your core 9s, that's kind of that sweet spot that you can just kind of normalize your guns for this content, even at the higher spectrum, and then shifting into your core 10s. Now, granted, you can ultimately decide what you want to do. If you want to roll the die there and chance your luck, you might get lucky. A low roll on a core 10, which I have to admit is much better than a high roll on a core 9, but it's just a simple fact that you want to manage your resources as best as you possibly can so that you're just not wasting it and rolling into values that really aren't going to give you value, right? So going back into the equipment of the core, let's actually take a look at my enduring legacy to kind of dive a little bit deeper into what I was referring to. For example, if we look at that hit augmentation, you have only these 3 values to roll into. So it's going to be much easier for you to have the chances of rolling into that, or the core 10, or even a core 9. If say you're going from 7 to 9, you just have a much better chance or ratio, which is a 1 out of 3 chance, into you rolling that value that you're looking for. Versus with the precision augment, it's a 1 out of 6. And then on top of that, you have to factor in that you could possibly just roll the same value that you're not looking for multiple times over and over and over. So you really just want to work your way up. It's just going to be a lot easier. And on top of that, another important thing to note, guys, is that the very first time that you are rolling a stat, this is super important. The first time that you are rolling a stat on a piece of gear, it does not require you to have the second resource here, which you are going to need, which is the particle disruptor resource, okay? This also is something that you can make from the metal fragments, but this is not required on the initial roll. After that, then it's going to be required, okay? So just kind of keeping that in mind, that re-rolling requires this specific resource. And that's ultimately one of the things that you just have to kind of keep in the back of your mind, okay? Now, one of the other things that I want to mention before we shift here is the stats that you must have versus stats that are for your play style preference, okay? Now, if we're looking at, say, for example, the Enduring Legacy, using the augment slot, one of the main things you want to have here is the firearm attack in the free augment slot on this specific gun, okay? But when you're looking at the precision augment, this is where things can kind of vary, because here you can roll values that are a little bit more to your player preference. For example, you can roll recoil, but somebody might say they don't really care for the recoil roll. They want sprint speed, or they want to have more hip fire accuracy. So that is going to be reliant or dependent upon what kind of player you are and ultimately what kind of software you're utilizing. So for example, there are variations in what things you might require, whether or not you're playing on a older PC to a newer PC or older console to a newer console. So you do have to factor in those things as to what values you might go for. for. But ultimately, these are going to be some of those like flex spots where like you can kind of aim for values that are a little bit more comfy for you. There will be always generalized values that someone might recommend. Like I personally like being able to have more hip fire accuracy, so I don't have to aim down when I'm using my Enduring Legacy, but that might not be necessarily something that someone else would want, right? So it just entirely depends on what you prefer there. Again, also with the special augment slot, this is something that is going to be emphasized when you are talking about the specific content that you are bringing this gun into. And again, even if the gun is a gun that you are utilizing for, say the attribute is the Albion Cavalry, it's an ice gun, and you're using that against what should be, if I'm not mistaken, the Legion of Darkness, but you have to take it into another stage, and that's the stage you're farming, then you probably want to roll that on there so that you have a little bit more damage, because a 550% multiplier to that specific unit type is going to be quite insane. Not gonna lie. But ultimately, when you get to the point where you're able to have a gun for each specific type and weapon dungeon, then you're not really going to be changing this too often, right? So that's basically that. So ultimately, the main thing that I want you guys to take away from this is that you want to work your way up. Working your way up is going to be the biggest way for you to be able to get into this content so that you can have the most success. So with all that being said, I hope that that was able to give you some more insight on coring, because I think it is a very massive boon to your account if you're able to properly get into it. And even myself, I'm actually working on this myself. Like I'm going through the entire process with you guys. I'm not clear floor 30 yet, but I think it's also important to note that I'm progressively working up. Like the day before this, I was barely able to clear floor 26. And once I took the moment to actually sit and farm, it actually allowed me to be able to push all the way into floor 28, which I have cleared. I just haven't cleared it in the time requirement yet. So that's another point at which I'm just like, okay, let me go back to the drawing board, get some more of those mats built up, and then we'll start pushing our guns even further, get into some more of those core 10s, and then we'll start shifting into the next piece of content. I would say that at this point, guys, if you want to do respectively floors 28, 29, and even 30, you definitely want to have almost, if not all, of your slots on your guns at core 10. I think that's very important to note. I would say anywhere before there, you can kind of, dilly-dally, kind of get up there a little nilly-willy, with some core 9s, maybe a couple of core 8s. But once you start getting to this latter portion, core 10s are definitely going to be a huge requirement. And I would also say that when you're starting to do public operations, here's just a word of advice. People can tell whether or not you have your stuff built. So people will just straight up leave the match. And that's not me personally being toxic. I'm just saying people will leave, okay? So making sure that your guns are operable, you're using Descendants that work more optimally for those stages is just going to give you more of an opportunity for you to have much more smoother runs and much more consistent runs, where basically people are feeling like they're making it easier for themselves. If they feel like they're working too hard or it's too hard for them to do and it's not easier, granted, it's still some challenge to it, but if you're making it harder because you don't have your gun properly built or not the right Descendant, yeah, you're going to probably see people leave. Now, if you are trying to jump into this for the first time, I've definitely argued that for floors 1 through 20, it is really important that you just have a Descendant that works really well. Like Inez is one of these suggestions that I would give. I have a video usually linked down below that just shows her going through the highest difficulty stage at that time, which was floor 20, for skill damage. Now, once you get past that, skill damage does start to dwindle. Obviously, from floor 20 and up, or 21 and up, you will start to see that shift. And it starts to shift into your weapons, right? And I think that while you're working your way up, starting to consider some of the weapons that you want to utilize. Keep in mind, very weak to ice is one of the biggest ones here. You have very weak to poison, and then you have very weak to electricity. 2 guns I can name off the top of my head off rip that you can start investing in, for example, would be 1, Albion Cavalry. Right? So Albion Cavalry would be huge. It's a super early gun that a lot of people just have. And I would say an even earlier gun would be the Thunder Cage, right? So I personally, I just haven't used it, but that could be something that you can utilize, right? To make it much easier for yourself going through those floors. But again, if you focus on a specific thing, it'll just make the process much easier. I've even seen people not using the Thunder Cage, but they have a really well-built gun. And so it just makes it easier for them to get through the stage. So like I said, guys, all in all, through and through, if you just take the time, you fixate and focus on one thing at a time, you'll be perfectly fine. Like I said, I hope that this video was able to help you guys. Again, make sure that you guys like and subscribe to the channel. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. And also follow me on Twitch, twitch.tv/ZoxysCon. It will be linked down below. If you guys have any additional questions or would like to see more videos on specific topics, let me know in the comment section down below. I have a couple of other videos that will be following this one to kind of get more into gun choices as well as Descendants, but I wanted to make sure that I had this isolated just so that individuals had a much better idea as far as tackling the content itself as raw content. So that's basically that, guys. Everyone, stay blessed, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.